I woke up to the smell of antiseptic and the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. But the real nightmare did not start with the car crash that nearly killed me. It started with the voice of my own flesh and blood standing right outside my hospital door. My son looked at my bleeding, broken body, called me a troublesome old man, and simply walked away. 3 days later, he came back demanding I hand over everything I owned. But when he found my hospital bed completely empty, his arrogance turned to sheer panic. The nurse just smiled and handed him a single envelope, and what he found inside that envelope destroyed his entire world. If you are watching this, take a deep breath, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from today. I need to know you are with me because what I am about to tell you will make your blood run cold. The first thing I registered was the blinding, sterile white light of the emergency room piercing through my eyelids. Then came the pain. It was a deep, agonizing throb radiating from my chest, right where the steering wheel of my Ford truck had slammed into my ribs. My head felt like it had been split open with a sledgehammer. I tried to swallow, but my throat was as dry as the concrete dust I used to breathe in every single day. The steady, high-pitched beep of the EKG machine next to my bed was the only proof I was still alive. I was lying in a trauma bay at Ohio General Hospital. My memory was fragmented, coming back in violent flashes. The sudden screech of metal, the violent jerk of the steering wheel, the sickening crunch of my 20-year-old truck wrapping around a concrete highway barrier. I had survived, but just barely. I tried to move my arm to reach for the nurse call button, but the heavy medical bandages and IV lines held me down like chains. That was when I heard it. It was not the comforting voice of a doctor or the gentle tone of a caring nurse. It was a voice I recognized instantly, a voice I had spent 40 years of my life trying to nurture, protect, and provide for. It was my son, Derek. I kept my eyes closed, too weak to open them fully, but my hearing was perfectly sharp. I expected to hear panic in his voice. I expected to hear him begging the doctors to save my life. Instead, what I heard made the physical pain in my shattered ribs feel like absolutely nothing compared to the shattering of my heart. This troublesome old man always ruins my schedule. Derek was practically shouting, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated annoyance. Do you have any idea how important today is? I have a $2 million commercial real estate closing in exactly 1 hour. I am wearing a custom Italian suit, and you want me to stand around in an emergency room. I do not have time to sit here and hold his hand. I do not have time to change an old man's diapers. The words hit me harder than the concrete barrier. This was Derek, the boy I had taught to ride a bike. The boy whose college tuition I paid for in full in cash, so he would never know the burden of a student loan. I heard the tired, firm voice of the attending physician trying to reason with him. Sir, your father has suffered severe physical trauma. He has a serious head injury and deep internal bruising. We need to take him into surgery to relieve the pressure and stabilize his condition. As his next of kin, we need you to stay and sign these surgical consent forms right now. We cannot proceed without your authorization, and his condition could deteriorate rapidly. There was a brief pause. For a split second, a foolish part of me hoped Derek would realize the gravity of the situation. I hoped he would drop his expensive leather briefcase, rush to my bedside, and act like a son who loved his father. Instead, he scoffed. A loud, dismissive scoff that echoed off the cold tile walls of the hospital ward. Look, he is tough. He is a stubborn old mule. He will be fine. Just keep him sedated or whatever it is you people do. I am leaving. I will send my assistant to deal with the hospital paperwork later this afternoon if I get a chance. Sir, if you walk out that door right now, you are delaying critical medical care. The doctor sounded genuinely appalled. Then delay it. Derek snapped, his voice growing fainter as he clearly turned his back and began walking down the hallway. I am not losing my massive real estate commission over this inconvenience. Call me when he wakes up. The heavy emergency room doors clicked shut, sealing my fate. He was gone. He had actually walked out on me while I was bleeding on a stretcher. I lay there in the sterile silence, the EKG monitor, tracking the erratic pounding of my broken heart. Tears, hot and bitter, leaked from the corners of my closed eyes, soaking into the thin white hospital pillow. It was not the physical pain making me cry. It was the crushing weight of 40 years of wasted sacrifice. My mind drifted back to the early days. I built my underground construction business from absolutely nothing. Just one single rusted-out truck and a pair of cheap steel-toed boots. I spent decades down in the dark trenches, literally buried in mud, breathing in toxic silica dust, working 18-hour shifts in the freezing Ohio winters. My hands were calloused, my back was permanently damaged, and my skin was scarred, all so Derek could have a very different life. I bought him the expensive clothes so he would fit in with the wealthy kids at his private school. I paid for his Ivy League business degree so he could sit in air-conditioned offices and close million-dollar deals without ever breaking a sweat. I gave him everything, absolutely everything, so he would never have to struggle like I did. And this was my return on investment. In my absolute darkest hour, lying bleeding and helpless on a hospital bed, I was nothing more than a troublesome burden interrupting his schedule. He cared more about a real estate commission than whether his father lived or died. He would rather let me suffer, maybe even bleed out internally, than be late for a corporate meeting. I squeezed my eyes shut, letting the horrible betrayal wash over me. The grief was completely suffocating, but as I lay there listening to my own ragged breathing, something deep inside my soul began to shift. The sadness slowly began to harden into something else. The devastated father, who just wanted his son's love, was fading away, and the ruthless self-made businessman, who survived 40 years in the cutthroat construction industry, was finally waking up. Derek thought I was just an old, broken man who had outlived his usefulness. He thought he could discard me like trash and just come back later to collect his inheritance, but he was incredibly wrong. He had no idea who he was dealing with. I was not dead yet, and by the time I was finished with him, he was going to wish I was. I slowly forced my eyes open, the bright fluorescent lights stinging my pupils. The nurse was standing near the foot of my bed, holding a medical clipboard, her face pale and her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and absolute shock. She had heard every single word my son had said. She looked at me, a silent apology in her eyes for the cruelty of my own blood. I did not want her pity. I did not want anyone's pity. I swallowed hard, forcing moisture into my dry throat, and managed to croak out a single definitive sentence. I am awake. Give me the damn papers, I will sign them myself. My hands were shaking violently, covered in dried blood and dark purple bruises, but I gripped the pen she handed me with a fierce, burning determination. I signed my own name authorizing the emergency surgery that my son could not be bothered to approve. Every stroke of the ink pen was a promise to myself. I had spent my entire life building a multi-million-dollar legacy to leave behind for a family that did not respect me. That ended today. The boy I raised was dead to me. The man who just walked out of this room was a parasite, and I had spent way too many years excavating dirt to let a parasite bury me. The heavy wooden door of the emergency room clicked shut behind the doctor, leaving me entirely alone in the sterile silence of the trauma bay. The only sound was the steady rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor next to my bed, a mechanical reminder that I was still tethered to this world. I let my head fall back against the thin hospital pillow, the rough cotton scraping against the deep lacerations on my scalp. The adrenaline that had surged through my veins when I forced myself to sign those surgical consent forms was slowly beginning to fade, replaced by a deep, hollow ache in my chest that had absolutely nothing to do with my fractured ribs. I stared up at the blinding fluorescent lights embedded in the ceiling panels. My mind was racing, replaying the sheer disgust in Derek's voice. I had spent my entire adult life trying to build a fortress for my family. I had poured concrete, laid steel, and broken my own back to ensure my son would never have to know the bitter taste of poverty. But in my desperate attempt to give him everything I had, somehow raised a man who valued a real estate commission over his own father's life. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow. I felt a profound sense of failure, not as a businessman, but as a father. A few minutes later, the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes broke my train of thought. The door pushed open gently, and my nurse walked back into the room. Her name tag read Sarah. She was a younger woman, maybe in her early 30s, with tired but incredibly kind eyes. She carried a small stainless steel basin filled with warm water, some clean gauze, and a fresh bottle of antiseptic. She moved quietly, almost reverently, as if she were stepping into a church rather than a trauma ward. Sarah set the basin down on the rolling tray next to my bed and wrung out a piece of gauze. She did not say a word as she began to carefully dab away the dried, crusted blood from my forehead and cheeks. The warm water felt soothing against my battered skin, a stark contrast to the coldness I had just experienced from my own flesh and blood. I watched her work, feeling a sudden, overwhelming wave of embarrassment. I was a proud man. I had always handled my own problems. Having a stranger witness my son treat me like a piece of garbage was incredibly humiliating. I cleared my throat, the sound rough and grating. "I am sorry about that." I mumbled, my voice barely above a whisper. "I am sorry you had to hear him yell at you. He is usually just very focused on his work. He is under a lot of pressure right now with the economy." I was making excuses for him. Even after he had abandoned me, the ingrained habit of a father protecting his son was still there. Sarah stopped what she was doing. She did not look at me with pity, which I was incredibly grateful for. Instead, her expression hardened into something much more serious. She dropped the bloodied gauze into the waste bin and wiped her hands on a towel. She did not respond to my apology right away. Instead, she walked past my bed, went straight to the heavy wooden door of the room, and quietly pulled it shut until it clicked securely into the doorframe. She even took a quick glance out the small rectangular glass window into the hallway to make sure no one was lingering outside. My heart rate picked up slightly, the monitor beside me beeping just a fraction faster. The atmosphere in the room instantly shifted. The quiet compassion of a nurse caring for an injured old man evaporated, replaced by a thick, palpable tension. Sarah walked back to my bedside. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to an urgent, hushed whisper. "Mr. Caldwell, please do not apologize to me. You have absolutely nothing to apologize for. But you need to listen to me very carefully right now." I frowned, wincing as the movement pulled at the stitches above my eyebrow. I nodded slowly, giving her my full attention. She looked down at her hands for a brief second before locking her eyes directly onto mine. "The highway patrol officer who responded to your crash just called the nurse's station a few minutes ago. He needed to speak with the attending physician, but he gave me a message to pass along to you as soon as you were coherent." I felt a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. Did I hit someone else? I asked, panic suddenly flaring in my chest. Did someone else get hurt in the crash? "No, nobody else was hurt," Sarah said quickly, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You hit the concrete divider just like you thought. But the officer called because they had a tow truck pull your Ford out of the ditch, and the mechanics did a standard safety inspection on the wreckage at the impound lot." She paused, taking a deep, shaky breath. "Mr. Caldwell, they inspected the undercarriage of your truck. The officer said your brake lines did not fail from wear and tear. They did not burst from the impact of the crash. They were cleanly cut. Someone took a pair of heavy-duty wire snips and purposefully severed the hydraulic lines right near the master cylinder." The words hung in the sterile air of the hospital room, heavy and suffocating. They were cleanly cut. For a moment, the entire world seemed to stop spinning. The persistent throbbing in my head faded into the background. The pain in my chest disappeared completely. My brain, trained by decades of navigating the treacherous waters of commercial construction contracts and shady union bosses, immediately began to process this new, horrifying data. Brake lines do not just cut themselves. My truck was fully serviced less than 2 weeks ago by a mechanic I had trusted for over 15 years. The only place that truck had been parked since then was inside my own locked private garage at my house. And the only other person on the entire planet who had the security code to that garage was Derek. In the span of a single heartbeat, the crushing grief of a heartbroken father vanished completely. It was replaced by a massive rushing wave of ice-cold adrenaline. This was not an accident. This was not a tragic twist of fate. This was a calculated, deliberate act of sabotage. My own son had not just abandoned me in a hospital room. He was the reason I was in the hospital room in the first place. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was staggering, but I did not break down. I did not cry. The man who wept over a rude son was gone. The survival instinct of a self-made man, a man who had fought tooth and nail for every single dollar he had ever earned, took over completely. Someone had tried to murder me. Someone had tried to send my truck careening into oncoming traffic, hoping I would end up in a body bag so they could inherit my life's work. I looked up at Sarah. The fear in her eyes was genuine. She knew exactly what she had just told me. She knew she was standing next to a man who was the target of a very real, very dangerous plot. "Thank you, Sarah," I said, my voice completely steady now, devoid of any warmth or weakness. "I need you to do me one more favor. I need you to bring me my personal belongings. Now." The game had fundamentally changed. I was no longer a victim. I was a man going to war. Sarah hesitated for only a fraction of a second before nodding. She understood the shift in my demeanor. I watched her hurry out of the room, her rubber shoes squeaking softly against the linoleum floor. Left alone again, I closed my eyes and forced my concussed brain to analyze the situation with absolute clarity. The throbbing in my skull was intense, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I had to treat this like one of my underground construction projects, where a single structural failure could cause a massive collapse. The structural failure here was my own son. Derek was the only person on Earth who had the security code to my private garage. I had programmed the keypad myself, giving him a unique PIN when he moved into his new house just in case he ever needed to borrow my tools. He had the access, the motive, and clearly the lack of conscience. I was sitting on a $5 million estate built from decades of grueling labor, and right now, laying in this hospital bed, I was a sitting duck. If Derek wanted me dead badly enough to cut my brake lines, coming back to finish the job while I was sedated and helpless was not out of the question. I could not stay here. Sarah returned a few minutes later, clutching a clear plastic bag containing my ruined clothes, my wallet, and most importantly, my cell phone. She placed it gently on the edge of the bed. I thanked her quietly and told her to go check on her other patients. I needed her out of the room so she would not be held responsible for what I was about to do. I waited patiently for the wall clock to hit 7 in the evening, the exact time hospitals usually underwent their major nursing shift change. The hallway outside my door became a chaotic blur of voices, rolling carts and distracted medical staff swapping patient charts. It was my perfect window of opportunity. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the sharp, stabbing pain in my fractured ribs, and slowly sat up on the edge of the mattress. My head spun wildly, the room tilting on its axis, but I forced myself to breathe through the nausea. I reached over to the rolling metal stand next to me and deliberately peeled the surgical tape off the back of my hand. With one swift, decisive motion, I pulled the intravenous needle out of my vein. A small bead of blood welled up on my skin, which I quickly wiped away with my thumb. Next came the wires connecting my chest to the heart monitor. I unclipped them one by one, watching the green line on the screen go completely flat, before reaching over and turning the machine off entirely so the alarms would not sound. I was unhooked. I grabbed my cell phone from the plastic bag. The screen was cracked from the impact of the crash, but it still powered on. I bypassed my usual contacts and opened a secure encrypted messaging app I rarely used. I dialed the private number of Harrison Barnes. Harrison was not just my corporate lawyer. He was a vicious, brilliant legal shark who had helped me navigate the most treacherous business waters in Ohio for over 20 years. More importantly, he was a loyal friend who despised my son's arrogant behavior almost as much as I currently did. He answered on the second ring, his gruff voice demanding to know who was calling him during dinner. "It is Rick," I said, my voice low and urgent. "I am at Ohio General. Someone cut the brake lines on my truck. Derek was the only one with the garage code. I am pulling the plug on everything, Harrison. Lock down my accounts, freeze the credit lines, and get your security team ready. I am going off the grid tonight, and I need you to be my command center." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of a chair scraping against a hardwood floor. Harrison did not ask useless questions. He simply told me to get out of the building safely, and that a discreet black sedan would be waiting for me in the alleyway behind the hospital cafeteria in exactly 20 minutes. I hung up the phone and began the agonizing process of getting dressed. Every movement sent shockwaves of fire through my bruised torso. I slipped my torn, blood-stained flannel shirt over my shoulders and managed to pull on my jeans. I shoved my feet into my work boots, not bothering to bend over and tie the laces. I gripped the edge of the hospital bed, steadied my trembling legs, and walked straight out into the hallway. The new shift nurses were busy at the central station, loudly arguing over medication schedules. I bypassed them, keeping my head down and heading straight for the main discharge desk. The clerk immediately looked up in alarm, demanding I return to my room right now. I slammed my fist down onto the hard counter, demanding the against medical advice forms. The clerk flinched quickly, printing the document. I aggressively scribbled my messy signature directly across the bottom line, completely absolving the medical hospital of any liability if I dropped dead out in the hospital parking lot. I did not wait for her to slowly process the printed paperwork. I turned around and walked swiftly down the dark back corridor, smoothly slipping through the heavy steel fire doors that led directly down to the basement service exit. The cool, crisp Ohio night air hit my face as I forcefully pushed through the final set of metal doors and stepped out into the dimly lit brick alleyway. The sleek black sedan was already sitting there, quietly idling by the large dumpsters. I climbed heavily into the dark leather back seat, completely disappearing into the absolute safety of the shadows. 3 days passed in absolute silence. I spent those 72 hours locked safely inside the heavily guarded guest suite of Harrison Barnes's private estate, turning my grief into a highly calculated weapon. I had asked Harrison to pull strings and acquire the internal security camera footage from Ohio General Hospital. I needed to see exactly how my son would react when he realized his prey had slipped right through his fingers. I sat in a high-backed leather chair in Harrison's study, nursing a glass of bourbon, watching the digital timestamp on the monitor tick forward to Friday morning. The hospital lobby doors slid open on the screen, and there he was. Derek walked in, looking like the picture-perfect, deeply concerned son. But he was not alone. Clinging to his arm was his wife, Monica. Seeing her face on that monitor made the bourbon burn the back of my throat. Monica was a fiercely ambitious, fiercely manipulative woman who wore designer clothes paid for by my sweat. She was the one who constantly whispered in Derek's ear, convincing him that my money was actually their money. They made quite the theatrical entrance. Derek was holding a small, pathetically cheap bouquet of carnations from a local gas station, a stark contrast to the expensive tailored suit he was wearing. Monica was carrying a thick leather-bound folder tucked tightly against her side. I did not need to be a psychic to know. Those were legal documents, probably a power of attorney, or a transfer of property deed, ready for a medicated, brain-damaged old man to blindly sign. They marched right up to the central nurses' station. Through the audio feed, I listened to my son put on the performance of a lifetime. He leaned his elbows on the tall counter, lowering his head, his shoulders shaking as if he were holding back a tidal wave of tears. "I am looking for my father, Richard Caldwell," he said, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "I was here 3 days ago when they brought him in from the crash. I panicked. I was just so completely overwhelmed with grief seeing him covered in blood that I had a panic attack and had to leave. I feel like the most terrible son in the world. Monica rubbed his back soothingly, looking at the duty nurse with wide, sympathetic eyes. "It has been a nightmare for our family," she added softly. "We are here to bring him home. We have a private nurse waiting at our house, and we just want to make sure he is comfortable and surrounded by family." It was a beautiful, plausible lie. If I had not heard him complaining about his real estate commission while I was bleeding on a stretcher, I might have actually believed it myself. The duty nurse on the screen was not Sarah. It was a younger woman who looked down at her computer terminal, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. She typed a few keys, looked back at Derek, and then pointed down the long, brightly lit corridor toward the surgical recovery ward. "Room 312, the nurse said, her voice hesitant. "But sir, you should know that." Derek did not even let her finish the sentence. The moment he got the room number, the fake tears instantly vanished. He grabbed Monica by the elbow and practically sprinted down the hallway. He was a man on a mission, eager to get that signature, before I regained my full mental faculties. I leaned closer to the computer monitor, my heart pounding a steady, hard rhythm against my bruised ribs. The camera feed switched to the hallway outside room 312. Derek pushed the heavy wooden door open and strode confidently inside with Monica following close behind, already unzipping that leather folder. But the room was not filled with the steady beep of a heart monitor. It was completely silent. The hospital bed was not occupied by a broken, vulnerable old man. It was stripped bare. The mattress was flattened. The white sheets were perfectly tucked with hospital corners, and the medical equipment was powered down and pushed against the far wall. Derek froze right in the middle of the room. The cheap gas station flowers slipped from his fingers, hitting the linoleum floor with a soft, pathetic thud. He stared at the empty bed, his mouth hanging slightly open. Monica bumped into him from behind, her eyes darting frantically around the small room, checking the adjoining bathroom, checking behind the privacy curtain. The realization hit them both at the exact same time. I was gone. The facade of the loving, concerned family completely shattered into a million pieces. Derek spun around, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. He stormed back out into the hallway, his dress shoes loudly slapping against the floor, screaming for a doctor. "Where is he?" he yelled, startling a passing orderly. "Where is the old man who was in this bed?" Monica stayed inside the room for a few moments longer, her grip tightening on the legal folder until her knuckles turned completely white. I could see the cold, hard calculation in her eyes through the grainy security footage. She knew that an empty bed meant they had lost control of the narrative. An empty bed meant my $5 million estate was suddenly out of their immediate reach. Derek came storming back into the room, his chest heaving with rage, pulling his cell phone out of his pocket and frantically dialing my number. I sat in Harrison's office watching my phone light up silently on the desk right next to my bourbon glass. I did not answer his desperate calls. I simply sat back in the leather chair, took a slow sip of the burning liquor, and watched my ungrateful son completely unravel on the high-definition screen, knowing with absolute certainty that the worst consequences for his terrible actions were still yet to come. I watched Derek pace frantically across the small hospital room, his leather shoes squeaking sharply against the linoleum. He was shouting into his phone, leaving a rapid-fire voicemail on my number. "Dad." "Where are you?" he pleaded into the receiver, though the anger underneath his tone was unmistakable. "You are confused. You have a serious head injury. You need to call me back immediately so I can come and get you." He slammed the phone into his pocket and turned his wrath toward the doorway. He was about to march back to the nurse's station to demand the hospital administrator, but the heavy wooden door pushed open. It was Nurse Sarah. She stepped into the room with a calm demeanor that perfectly masked the tension of the moment. She looked at Derek, then at the empty bed, and finally at Monica, who was clutching her legal folder like a shield. "Mr. Caldwell was discharged against medical advice late last night," Sarah stated evenly, her voice devoid of the sympathy she had shown me. He left strict instructions that no information regarding his whereabouts was to be shared with anyone, especially his family. Derek stepped forward, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. "He is not in his right mind," he snapped, pointing a finger at her. "You let a man with severe brain trauma wander out into the street. I am going to sue this hospital for every penny it has." Sarah did not flinch. She simply reached into her pocket. "Actually," she replied, keeping her voice level. The attending physician cleared him to make his own decisions. "But Mr. Caldwell did ask me to give you something if you came looking for him." She pulled out a heavy manila envelope and held it out. The transformation in Derek's posture was instantaneous and sickening to watch. The fake panic and aggressive posturing evaporated in a split second. His eyes locked onto the paper package and a look of absolute greed washed over his face. He assumed I realized my own mortality during the lonely night and decided to hand over the keys to the kingdom. I watched through the security feed as Monica stepped closer, her eyes shining with anticipation. She thought it was the signed power of attorney they had been hoping for, or maybe a newly drafted last will and testament naming Derek as the sole executor of my $5 million estate. Derek snatched the envelope roughly from Sarah's hand without a single word of thanks. He practically tore at the reinforced flap, his fingers fumbling in his haste. "This is it," I heard him whisper to Monica, a triumphant smirk spreading across his face. "The stubborn old fool finally realized he needs us to manage his affairs." He reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of crisp documents bound together in a heavy black clip. But as his eyes scanned the bold letters printed across the top of the first page, the smug smile vanished from his lips. It was wiped out, replaced instantly by a mask of sheer horror. The blood drained from his face until he looked physically ill. His hands began to shake violently, making the crisp paper rattle. Monica leaned over his shoulder, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What is it, Derek?" she demanded, her voice tight with sudden anxiety. "What did he sign over to us?" Derek could not even speak. He just stood there, paralyzed, staring at the document as if it were a venomous snake. It was not a power of attorney. It was not a transfer of wealth. It was a legally binding court-approved notice of immediate foreclosure. Specifically, it was the foreclosure notice for his breathtaking multi-million-dollar McMansion located in the most exclusive gated community in the city. The huge house with the imported marble floors, the custom infinity pool, and the 4-car garage. The paper in his shaking hands was a formal declaration from the bank that he had exactly 30 days to vacate the premises before the local sheriff arrived to forcibly change the locks and throw all of his extremely expensive designer furniture out onto the street. I took another satisfying sip of my bourbon, letting the burning sensation warm my chest as I watched his world fall apart on the monitor. You see, Derek was a man who loved to portray the image of a highly successful commercial real estate broker, but his entire life was built on a foundation of massive, unsustainable debt. A few years ago, when he wanted to buy that ridiculous mansion to impress his wealthy clients, he could not secure the mortgage on his own merit. So he came crying to me. Against my better judgment, I allowed him to quietly use the massive credit line of my underground construction company as collateral to back his jumbo loan. It was a silent guarantee that kept the bank happy. But for the last 48 hours, while Derek thought I was lying helpless in a hospital bed, Harrison Barnes and I had been working around the clock. We ruthlessly severed every single financial tie between my corporate entities and Derek's personal accounts. We pulled the company collateral out from under his mortgage with a single aggressive legal maneuver. Without my company backing him, his massive loan was instantly triggered into a catastrophic default status. The bank did not care about his Italian suits or his fancy deals. They only cared about the money, and without my guarantee, Derek was functionally bankrupt. I watched him drop the heavy papers onto the stripped hospital bed, his knees buckling slightly, as the full weight of his financial ruin crushed down on him. He was losing his precious home. He was losing his social status, And most importantly, he was losing his unearned money. But the beautiful part of this entire perfectly executed trap was that this foreclosure was only the very beginning of his absolute nightmare. Derek's hands trembled so violently that the thick stack of foreclosure documents rustled like dry leaves in a winter wind. He could not tear his eyes away from the bold black letters declaring his imminent ruin. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his expensive custom suit. Monica, losing her patience and completely misreading his absolute terror, stepped forward with a sharp click of her designer heels. She snatched the heavy bundle of papers right out of his hands, her face twisted in an ugly grimace of irritation. She thought he was just being dramatic. But as she aggressively yanked the documents toward her chest, something slipped out from between the densely printed pages. It was not another legal notice. It was a single glossy photograph. It fluttered through the sterile hospital air for a brief moment before landing face up on the polished linoleum floor right between Derek's expensive leather shoes. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. Even Nurse Sarah, who was standing quietly by the door, leaned forward slightly to see what had caused the color to drain completely from my son's face. Derek stared down at the photograph, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. The air in the hospital room seemed to instantly evaporate, leaving him gasping for a breath he could not catch. Through the high-definition security feed playing on Harrison's computer monitor, I zoomed in on the scene. I knew exactly what that photograph looked like because I had personally selected it from dozens of still frames just hours before. It was a crystal-clear, time-stamped image pulled directly from the hidden security cameras inside my personal mechanic's auto shop. The timestamp in the bottom right corner glowed with the date and time exactly 12 hours before my truck slammed into the concrete barrier. The image showed the dimly lit interior of the garage, and right there in the center of the frame, standing beneath the raised hydraulic lift holding my Ford truck, was Derek. He was wearing the exact same trench coat he had on right now. In the photograph, his arm was extended, and his hand was firmly grasping a thick, bulging envelope. He was passing that envelope directly into the grease-stained hands of the head mechanic, a man I had trusted to maintain my vehicles for over a decade. The envelope was visibly stuffed with thick stacks of $100 bills. The transaction was undeniable. The intent was absolutely clear. It was the irrefutable visual proof of a murder plot. I watched Derek's knees actually buckle as the horrifying realization finally crashed down upon him. He realized in that exact moment that I did not just know about his financial fraud. I knew about the cut brake lines. I knew he had tried to kill me. Monica looked down at the floor, her eyes narrowing as she tried to make sense of the glossy image. She bent over gracefully, picking up the photograph by its corner. She stared at it for a long, agonizing moment. I could see the gears turning in her calculating mind. She recognized the garage. She recognized her husband. And she recognized the massive bribe he was handing over. She dropped the picture as if it were a burning coal, taking a sudden terrified step backward, physically distancing herself from the man she had married. She knew instantly that this was no longer a simple matter of manipulating a senile old man out of his real estate properties. This was a massive federal crime, and the evidence was sitting right there in her hands. Derek was completely unspooling. The polished, arrogant real estate broker was gone, replaced by a cornered animal terrified of a long prison sentence. He frantically dug into his pockets, pulling out his cell phone with trembling fingers. He began jabbing at the shattered screen, his thumbs moving in a blur of pure panic. Back in the quiet mahogany-paneled study of my lawyer's estate, the silence was suddenly broken by the sharp, repetitive buzzing of my phone resting on the heavy wooden desk. I did not blink as the bright screen illuminated, casting a blue glow over my scarred knuckles. The text messages from Derek began pouring in one after the other, desperate and utterly pathetic. "Dad, where are you?" the first message read. The second arrived a second later. "You are confused. You are not thinking straight because of your head injury. Please let me help you." Another buzz rattled the phone against the mahogany surface. Dad, this is a massive misunderstanding. Please call me right now. I reached forward, my hand steady despite the lingering pain in my chest, and picked up my crystal glass of aged bourbon. I leaned back into the welcoming comfort of Harrison's leather desk chair, the dark leather creaking softly under my shifting weight. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the rich, smoky flavor coat my tongue and warm my throat. I watched the security monitor as Derek paced the small hospital room like a caged rat, staring down at his phone, desperately waiting for a reply that was never going to come. He was begging for a lifeline, praying with everything he had that his father was still the soft, forgiving man who would always bail him out of financial trouble. But that weak man had died in the twisted metal wreckage of a crushed Ford truck 3 long days ago. I set the heavy glass down next to the relentlessly buzzing phone and simply stared at the incoming messages, feeling absolutely nothing but a freezing cold, impenetrable resolve. I was not confused. I had never seen things more clearly in my entire long life. I was going to let him sweat, let the absolute terror marinate deeply in his bones, because the trap I had meticulously built for him was only half complete, and I was truly just getting started. I finally turned my attention away from the glowing screen of my cell phone and looked across the expansive mahogany desk. Harrison Barnes was sitting there, surrounded by towering stacks of financial documents, bank statements, and corporate tax returns. The heavy velvet curtains of his study were drawn tightly shut, blocking out the morning sun, and the only light came from a pair of green glass banker lamps. This room was a fortress. It was soundproofed, highly secure, and currently serving as the war room for the systematic dismantling of my own son. For the past 2 days, while Derek was busy playing the role of the grieving child at the hospital, Harrison had unleashed a team of 3 ruthless forensic accountants. Their only job was to tear apart every single aspect of Derek's personal and professional life. I wanted a complete autopsy of his betrayal. I wanted to know exactly why my son was willing to sever the brake lines of my truck just to get his hands on my estate. Harrison picked up a thick folder bound with a red rubber band and tossed it onto the center of the desk. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, looking at me with a mixture of professional respect and deep personal sympathy. "Rick," he said, his voice grave and low. "I have been doing this for 30 years. I have seen corporate embezzlement, massive Ponzi schemes, and trust fund kids blowing through millions in a matter of months. But what your son has been doing is truly on another level of stupidity." Harrison opened the folder and began sliding pieces of paper across the polished wood toward me. I leaned forward, ignoring the sharp twinge in my ribs, and looked at the spreadsheets. For years, Derek had paraded around the city, acting like a titan of commercial real estate. He drove luxury cars, wore custom Italian suits, and constantly boasted about his massive multi-million-dollar closings. But looking at these naked numbers, the reality was entirely different. His entire real estate brokerage was nothing more than a carefully constructed shell game. He was not making money. He was simply moving it from one failing project to another, constantly robbing Peter to pay Paul. When the commercial market took a slight downturn last year, his fragile house of cards completely collapsed. According to the accountants, Derek had not closed a single legitimate, profitable deal in over 14 months. I stared at the red ink bleeding across the pages. "How bad is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Harrison sighed heavily. "It is a bloodbath, Rick. His corporate accounts are completely drained. His personal savings are gone. He has maxed out every single credit card in his name and his wife's name. But that is not even the worst part." Harrison slid a final, highly confidential document across the desk. It was not a standard bank statement. It was a ledger. And it detailed a series of massive irregular cash wire transfers from offshore accounts. "Derek owes money," Harrison explained softly. "A lot of money. And he does not owe it to conventional banks or standard lending institutions. When the traditional credit lines dried up, he got desperate. He went to the secondary market. Unregulated private equity firms, hard money lenders, and individuals who do not take kindly to missed payments. These are people who do not send foreclosure notices in the mail. They send men to your house to break your legs or make you disappear. I stared at the final number circled in thick black ink at the bottom of the page. $3 million. My son was $3 million in debt to extremely dangerous people. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The cut brake lines, the mechanic, the sudden rush to the hospital, the desperate text messages. It all suddenly made terrifying sense. This was never just about simple greed. It was about pure, unfiltered survival. Derek did not just want my money so he could buy another sports car or a bigger house. He needed my $5 million estate to save his own life and to stay out of federal prison. He was drowning in an ocean of debt, and the private lenders were clearly circling him like sharks smelling blood in the water. They were likely threatening him, breathing down his neck, demanding their money immediately. And instead of coming to me, instead of sitting down with his father and begging for help like a man, he chose the coward's way out. He calculated that my sudden tragic death in a terrible traffic accident would instantly liquidate my assets. As my only legal heir, the money would flow directly to him, allowing him to quietly pay off his dangerous creditors without anyone ever discovering the pathetic truth about his failed business empire. I leaned back in the leather chair, closing my eyes for a brief moment. The betrayal was no longer just an act of cold greed. It was an act of absolute desperation. But understanding his motive did not make me feel any sympathy for him. In fact, it made me despise him even more. He was willing to sacrifice my life just to cover up his own miserable failures. He valued his fake reputation and his physical safety more than he valued the man who had given him everything. I opened my eyes, looking at the damning ledger on the desk. The fear driving him meant he was unpredictable. It meant he would stop at nothing to get my money, and I needed to be ready. Harrison closed the heavy folder, leaned back in his chair, and poured me another glass of expensive bourbon. The true hunt had finally begun, and I was going to make sure that my son faced the absolute worst consequences. Harrison did not give me time to process the sheer weight of the $3 million debt before he reached down into his heavy leather briefcase sitting on the Persian rug. The brass clasps clicked loudly in the quiet study. He pulled out another document, but this one was not a bank ledger or a financial spreadsheet. It was bound in a stiff blue cardboard backing, the kind used exclusively for official legal filings. He placed it squarely in the center of the mahogany desk. I stared at the embossed seal of the Ohio Probate Court stamped near the top corner. My eyes slowly traced the bold black ink of the title printed across the front page. Petition for the appointment of a conservator and legal guardian. Directly beneath that terrifying title were the names of the petitioners, Derek and Monica Caldwell, and beneath their names, listed as the proposed ward of the state, was my name, Richard Caldwell. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. I reached out and pulled the document closer, my fingers tracing the cold legal text. I have read thousands of contracts in my life, negotiated massive construction deals, and fought through complex labor disputes. But reading the words on this page filled me with a primal, suffocating terror that I had never experienced before. The legal jargon was dense, but the objective was crystal clear. My son and my daughter-in-law were formally asking a judge to strip me of every single basic human right I possessed. They were petitioning the court to declare me mentally incompetent, claiming that I was suffering from severe, irreversible cognitive decline. If a judge signed this piece of paper, I would cease to exist as an independent adult in the eyes of the law. I would not be able to vote. I would not be able to sign a contract. I would not even be able to decide what I wanted to eat for breakfast. Derek would be granted absolute, unchecked legal control over my entire life, my medical decisions, my company, and my $5 million retirement fund. Harrison leaned his elbows on the desk, his hands clasped tightly together. "Do you see the brilliance of their sick little plan now, Rick?" he asked, his voice filled with a cold, simmering rage. "If the brake lines had been completely severed and you had died in that car crash, your estate would have been locked up in the probate process for months. The courts would require a full accounting of your assets. The life insurance companies would launch their own mandatory investigations into the accident. Everything would be frozen. Derek would not be able to access a single dime of your money until the entire legal process was finished. And as we just saw from the financial ledgers, Derek did not have months to wait. Those loan sharks were breathing down his neck. He needed liquid cash immediately to save his own skin." I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead as the horrifying truth finally clicked into place. The cut brakes were never meant to kill me. They were meticulously calculated to maim me. Derek knew my route. He knew I drove that heavy Ford truck down the steep grade of Interstate 71 every single Tuesday afternoon. He wanted me to crash just hard enough to sustain a severe traumatic brain injury. He wanted me to survive, but he wanted me completely incapacitated, a living, breathing vegetable, because a disabled father does not trigger a lengthy probate investigation. A disabled father simply requires a loving, devoted son to step in and take control of his finances through an emergency conservatorship. With a judge's signature on this petition, Derek could walk into any bank in the state of Ohio, present the court order, and legally drain my $5 million retirement account by the end of the business day. He could pay off his massive debts to the criminal underworld, secure his ridiculous mansion, and I would be none the wiser trapped inside my own broken mind. I read through the specific allegations they had outlined in the petition. It was a masterclass in manipulation and perjury. They claimed I had been exhibiting signs of severe paranoia and dementia for over a year. They fabricated stories about me getting lost in my own neighborhood, forgetting the names of my employees, and mismanaging my company funds. They had even managed to secure a preliminary affidavit from a corrupt, paid-off private physician who claimed my recent head injury from the car crash was the final devastating blow to my cognitive abilities. They had built a perfect, airtight legal cage to lock me inside. The sheer sociopathic calculation of it all took my breath away. My own son had looked at me, the man who had wiped his tears and paid his way through life, and decided that my brain was worth more to him completely destroyed than it was intact. He wanted to turn me into a helpless, drooling ward of the state, just so he could maintain his pathetic illusion of wealth. I dropped the heavy court document back onto the desk, feeling a physical wave of nausea wash over me. I had survived the treacherous trenches of underground construction, only to be ambushed by the very person I had built it all for. But the nightmare was not over. Harrison was not finished showing me the true depth of their cruelty. Harrison reached into the folder one last time. He did not pull out another dense legal document or a complicated financial spreadsheet. Instead, he pulled out a simple single piece of paper. It looked like a standard bank receipt. He slid it slowly across the polished mahogany wood until it rested right next to the horrific guardianship petition. I stared down at it, my eyes struggling to focus on the small printed numbers. It was a receipt for a wire transfer in the amount of $10,000. The transaction had been authorized by Monica, drawn from one of her last remaining heavily burdened credit cards. But it was not the amount of the money that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was the name of the beneficiary printed clearly at the top of the slip. Shady Pines Convalescent Center. I knew that name. Anyone who lived in our part of Ohio knew the dark, whispered reputation of Shady Pines. It was not a luxury retirement community with manicured golf courses and smiling nurses. It was a bleak state-run facility located on the very edge of the county, hidden away behind a barrier of dying pine trees and rusted chain-link fences. It was a place where families sent the people they wanted to completely forget. A warehouse for the unwanted. Over the years, I had read the disturbing investigative reports in the local newspaper. Shady Pines had been cited dozens of times by the state health board for severe neglect, understaffing, and horrific elder abuse. But their most notorious violation, the one that made the facility infamous, was their widespread use of chemical restraints. The investigative journalists had exposed how the staff routinely injected their difficult patients with heavy doses of haloperidol and powerful liquid sedatives, effectively turning the elderly residents into compliant, silent zombies who would lay in their beds for days without making a single sound. My hands began to shake again, but this time it was not from shock. It was from a pure, unadulterated fury that burned hotter than the center of the sun. Monica had paid a non-refundable $10,000 deposit to secure a private room for me in that absolute hellhole. This was their grand plan for my retirement. While Derek and Monica lived in their multi-million-dollar mansion, hosting lavish dinner parties and spending the $5 million I had broken my back to earn, I would be locked away in a dark, urine-smelling room at Shady Pines. I would be strapped to a bed, pumped full of antipsychotic drugs, until my mind actually did deteriorate into nothingness. I would spend the final years of my life trapped in a medicated haze, completely unable to speak, unable to fight back, and unable to tell anyone the truth about what my own family had done to me. They were not just going to steal my money. They were going to steal my soul. They were going to torture me until the day I finally stopped breathing. I picked up the receipt, my scarred fingers clutching the thin paper so tightly that it crumpled in my grip. I thought about Monica standing in that hospital room just an hour ago, looking at my empty bed with calculating eyes. I thought about the way she had smoothed her designer skirt, holding that leather folder filled with lies, entirely prepared to condemn me to a chemical prison without shedding a single genuine tear. She had orchestrated the logistics of my eternal punishment, while Derek had executed the physical sabotage of my truck. They were a perfect, monstrous team. The sheer depravity of their plan stripped away any lingering hesitation in my heart. Any tiny microscopic fragment of fatherly love or forgiveness that might have somehow survived the car crash was instantly incinerated by the reality of this $10,000 receipt. I looked up at Harrison. The veteran lawyer was watching me closely, reading the complete transformation in my eyes. The shock and the grief were entirely gone. The scared, heartbroken father had been permanently erased. The man sitting in the leather chair now was the ruthless, hardened contractor who had spent 40 years crushing his competitors and surviving the most brutal industry on earth. I carefully smoothed out the crumpled receipt and placed it back on the desk, right on top of the guardianship petition. I took a deep, steadying breath, the pain in my fractured ribs feeling like nothing more than a dull, insignificant ache. They thought I was a broken old man, I said to Harrison, my voice completely cold and remarkably calm. They think I am weak, confused, and hiding like a coward. They think they have won the game because they hold the court documents and the medical reservations. Harrison nodded slowly, a dark, dangerous smile beginning to form on his lips. So what is the next move, Rick? He asked quietly. The next move, I replied, picking up my glass of bourbon and finishing it in one single burning swallow, is that we are going to give them exactly what they want. We are going to let them think their brilliant plan is working flawlessly. They want a confused, terrified old man who is easy to manipulate. I am going to give them the performance of a lifetime. I am going to walk right into their trap, and when they are standing right in the center of it, blinded by their own incredible greed, I am going to nap the steel jaws shut and completely destroy their entire world. Harrison pulled a fresh, blank legal pad toward him and picked up his heavy gold fountain pen. Tell me what you need, he said. I need a location, I told him, leaning forward, the strategy already forming perfectly in my mind. I need the cheapest, filthiest motel you can find on the outskirts of the city, and I need you to contact your friends over at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It is time to go hunting. Harrison did not flinch at my declaration. He simply nodded his eyes, reflecting the same calculated ruthlessness that had made us such a formidable team in the corporate world for over 2 decades. The heartbreak that had paralyzed me just a few days ago in that hospital bed was completely gone. In its place was a pure, cold fury that crystallized my thoughts and sharpened my senses. I looked at the guardianship petition and the nursing home deposit receipt lying on the desk. They were not just pieces of paper. They were declarations of war. I told Harrison that I did not want to simply walk into the probate court and block the conservatorship. That would be too easy. That would only stop their immediate plan, leaving them free to regroup and try something else. I wanted them utterly destroyed. I wanted them stripped of their wealth, their freedom, and their incredibly arrogant pride. I wanted Derek to feel the exact same suffocating terror I felt when I realized my own son had cut my brake lines. Harrison pulled a fresh sheet of paper from his drawer, and we began to draft the perfect trap. The first step was vulnerability. As long as I was hiding behind the heavily armed security gates of Harrison's private estate, Derek and Monica could not touch me. They needed to believe they had the upper hand. They needed to find me isolated and seemingly defenseless so they could force their final desperate move. I stood up from the leather chair, my body aching, but my spirit completely energized by the prospect of absolute justice. Harrison handed me a burner phone and a set of keys to an unmarked dark blue sedan parked in his secondary garage. I changed out of the comfortable clothes his staff had provided and put my blood-stained flannel shirt and dirt-crusted work boots back on. I needed to look the part of a confused, wandering old man suffering from a severe head injury. I drove out of the secure compound, leaving the absolute safety of the fortress behind. The Ohio sky was overcast, casting a dull gray light over the city as I navigated toward the industrial edge of town. This was a part of the city Derek avoided at all costs. It was gritty, rundown, and entirely forgotten by the wealthy elite. It was the perfect stage for the performance I was about to give. I pulled into the cracked, weed-filled parking lot of a dilapidated strip mall. At the far corner sat an independent, shady pharmacy that looked like it had not been renovated since the 1980s. The neon sign above the door was flickering, buzzing, with a low electrical hum. I pushed the heavy glass door open, a small bell chiming weakly above my head. The interior smelled like stale air and cheap antiseptic. I limped heavily down the narrow aisles, dragging my left foot, slightly exaggerating the physical toll of the car crash. I approached the high pharmacy counter, leaning heavily against the scratched glass display case. The pharmacist, a tired-looking man with thick glasses, barely glanced up from his computer screen. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a handwritten prescription for high-grade painkillers. It was a legitimate script the emergency room doctor had written for me before I slipped out of the hospital, intended to manage the excruciating pain of my fractured ribs. But I was not here just to get medication. I was here to send a highly specific digital flare up into the sky. The pharmacist took the paper, examined it for a brief moment, and then disappeared into the back room. When he returned with the small plastic bottle, he typed the information into his register and recited the total cost. I reached into my leather wallet, bypassing the thick stack of cash Harrison had given me, and bypassed my standard debit cards. Instead, I pulled out a heavy, solid metal card, my personal black American Express card. I handed the heavy metal card to the pharmacist. He looked slightly surprised by the prestigious card in such a rundown neighborhood, but he swiped it through the old machine without a word. As the machine processed the transaction, I stared at the small digital screen, waiting for the word approved to appear. I knew exactly what was happening at that very second. 3 years ago, when Derek was pretending to be a responsible son, he convinced me to let him set up a joint financial management app on his phone. He claimed it was to help me track my business expenses and protect me from identity theft. He had set up a permanent real-time alert for that specific black card. Every single time that card was swiped, a notification popped up directly on his cell phone detailing the exact location, the time, and the amount of the transaction. For 3 days, that card had been completely silent. Now a ping was vibrating in his pocket, telling him exactly where his vulnerable, heavily medicated father was hiding. The receipt printer buzzed, spitting out a small slip of paper. I signed my name with a deliberate, shaky hand. I took my bottle of painkillers and the heavy metal card, slipping them back into my pocket. I walked out of the pharmacy and stood by the dark blue sedan in the empty parking lot. I looked around the desolate street, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. The digital trap was officially sprung. The bait was set. Now all I had to do was drive to the shabby motel Harrison had rented, under a fake name, sit on the edge of a cheap bed, and wait for the absolute worst people in the world to kick the door down. I could already picture the sheer desperate panic washing over Derek's pale face as he stared at his illuminated phone screen. He was rapidly coming for me. I pulled the dark blue sedan out of the cracked asphalt of the pharmacy parking lot and drove exactly 2 blocks down the crumbling industrial avenue. Harrison had chosen the location with absolute precision. The Starlight Motel sat at the absolute dead end of a forgotten road, surrounded by abandoned warehouses and overgrown lots filled with rusted machinery. It was the kind of place that charged $40 a night, no questions asked, and demanded payment in untraceable cash. The neon sign near the road was half-broken, buzzing, with a persistent electrical hum that sounded like a dying insect. I parked the sedan around the back of the building, completely out of sight from the main road, and limped heavily toward room number 7. The key Harrison had given me turned stiffly in the rusted lock. I pushed the heavy hollow wooden door open and stepped into a space that smelled intensely of stale cigarette smoke, damp mildew, and cheap chemical cleaner. The carpet under my heavy work boots was a deeply stained brown, sticky in certain patches, and the wallpaper was peeling away from the corners of the ceiling in long, sad strips. The furniture consisted of a single, sagging mattress, covered in a faded floral bedspread, a bolted-down television from 2 decades ago, and a solitary wooden chair with one uneven leg. It was an environment designed for people who had absolutely nothing left to lose. It was the perfect stage for the final act of my son's destruction. I locked the door behind me and carefully slid the heavy metal chain into place. I walked over to the sagging bed and sat down heavily on the edge. The ancient springs groaned loudly in protest under my weight. My fractured ribs throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, but I refused to open the bottle of high-grade painkillers I had just purchased. I needed my mind to remain absolutely sharp, untainted by any chemical fog. I reached into the front pocket of my denim jeans and pulled out the small device Harrison had entrusted to me. It was a military-grade micro-recorder, no larger than a standard coat button. It was encased in a matte black finish designed to absorb light and remain completely undetectable to the naked eye. The tiny microphone was sensitive enough to pick up a whisper from across a crowded room, and the internal storage drive could hold hours of high-definition encrypted audio. I unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of my blood-stained flannel shirt and carefully positioned the small device right underneath the thick fabric of my collar. I secured it tightly using a piece of specialized double-sided adhesive tape that Harrison's private security team had provided. I pressed my fingers against the collar, smoothing the fabric down. The recorder was completely invisible, resting securely against my collarbone. I reached into my pocket, pressed the tiny activation switch on a remote fob, and felt a single microscopic vibration against my skin. The device was active. It was recording every single breath I took, every single rustle of fabric, and soon it would record the final damning confessions of the 2 people who had plotted to steal my life. With the technological trap successfully armed, I had to prepare the physical illusion. I stood up and walked over to the tiny stained mirror hanging above the bathroom sink. The fluorescent light flickered aggressively, casting harsh shadows across my face. I stared at my own reflection. I already looked terrible. The jagged laceration across my forehead, was still an angry red, the surgical stitches stark against my pale skin. The dark purple bruises around my eyes and jawbone made me look hollow and fragile. But terrible was not enough. I needed to look utterly broken. I needed to look like a man whose brain was slowly bleeding out, confused and incapable of defending himself. I reached up with trembling hands and violently mussed my gray hair, making it stick out in erratic directions. I unbuttoned one more button on my shirt, letting it hang slightly off my shoulder in a sloppy, disheveled manner. I forced my shoulders to slump forward, collapsing the strong, proud posture I had maintained for 40 years. I practiced the physical tremors, letting a slight, continuous shake travel through my hands and down into my knees. I looked at the old man in the mirror. He looked pathetic. He looked like easy prey. And that was exactly what Derek and Monica needed to see. I limped back into the main room and sat down on the edge of the sagging mattress once again. I stared at the heavy wooden door, the only barrier between me and the wolves that were currently hunting me. The afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon outside the dirty window, casting long, menacing shadows across the stained carpet. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the slow, steady dripping of the bathroom faucet. Every single drop of water felt like a loud tick of a metronome counting down the seconds until the inevitable confrontation. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing, slowing my heart rate down to a calm, steady rhythm. I knew they were coming. The digital ping from my heavy metal credit card had undoubtedly set their world on fire. Derek was a desperate man, staring down a $3 million debt to incredibly dangerous people, and his sudden foreclosure notice had pushed him right up to the absolute edge of sanity. He would not wait. He would track the location of the pharmacy, realize it was in a derelict neighborhood, and immediately start searching the surrounding area for a vulnerable, wandering old man. I sat on the filthy mattress, my hands shaking with an artificial tremor, while my mind remained as cold and clear as a frozen lake. I was ready. The ambush did not begin with a knock. It began with an explosion of sudden violence. The heavy wooden door of room number 7 violently buckled inward with a deafening crash, the cheap metal chain snapping instantly under the immense physical force. The door slammed aggressively against the interior wall, sending a shower of dry paint chips raining down onto the stained carpet. My eyes shot open, and I instinctively cowered back against the flimsy headboard, raising my trembling hands in front of my face in a defensive posture. My heart pounded against my bruised ribs, but I forced myself to maintain the pathetic illusion. Derek stormed into the small room, his chest heaving with exertion, his face a bright, mottled mask of absolute fury. He was still wearing his expensive custom Italian suit, but the jacket was completely unbuttoned. His silk tie was yanked loosely down his neck, and his dark hair was wild and damp with sweat. He looked nothing like the polished, arrogant real estate broker he pretended to be. He looked like a cornered rabid animal. Right behind him stepped Monica. She paused at the threshold, her nose wrinkling in profound disgust as the smell of stale smoke and mildew hit her face. She was wearing a pristine white designer coat and carrying her expensive leather handbag, looking entirely out of place in the squalor of the $40 motel. She stepped carefully over the splintered wood of the broken doorframe, her sharp eyes locking onto me, where I cowered on the bed. The mask of the loving, deeply concerned daughter-in-law was completely gone. There were no fake tears today. There were no sympathetic smiles or gentle touches. Her face was twisted into an ugly, hateful sneer. She looked at me not as a human being, not as a father, but as a disgusting obstacle that was standing between her and a $5 million fortune. "Look at you," Monica spat, her voice dripping with absolute venom. Her words echoed sharply in the small room. She took another step forward, her high heels clicking aggressively against the thin floorboards. "Look at this disgusting place. You are sitting on millions of dollars, Richard, and you hide in a filthy rat hole like a common criminal. But then again, I suppose this is exactly where you belong. You have always just been a dirty blue-collar relic. You built a fortune pulling dirt out of the ground, but you never actually learned how to handle real wealth. You do not deserve the money you have. You do not even know what to do with it. You are just a pathetic, stubborn old fool who is ruining everything for the people who actually have a future. Before I could even formulate a trembling response, Derek lunged across the short distance of the room. He did not hesitate. He did not ask if I was okay. He reached out with both hands and aggressively grabbed me by the shoulders. His fingers dug painfully into my bruised flesh through the fabric of my flannel shirt. He violently yanked me forward, pulling me completely off the headboard until my face was only inches away from his. I could smell the sour stench of fear and expensive cologne radiating off his skin. I could see the wild, desperate panic burning brightly in his wide eyes. "What did you do?" Derek screamed, his voice cracking with pure rage. Small drops of spittle flew from his lips and hit my cheek. "What did you do to my house, you crazy old man? I got a notice from the bank today. They are foreclosing on my property. They are taking my home because you somehow canceled the corporate guarantees." He shook me violently, my head snapping back and forth, the movement sending sharp spikes of agonizing pain shooting straight through my fractured ribs and my concussed skull. I let out a loud, pathetic whimper, letting my hands flail weakly against his chest. I forced tears to well up in my eyes, blinking rapidly, to let them spill down my bruised cheeks. "Derek, please." I begged, my voice a high, terrified rasp. "Please, you are hurting me. I do not understand. I do not know what you are talking about. My head hurts so badly. I just wanted to go home." "You are not going home," Derek roared, tightening his brutal grip on my shoulders and shaking me again, completely uncaring of my visible injuries. "You are ruining my entire life. Do you have any idea the kind of trouble I am in right now? Do you have any idea the kind of people who are looking for me? You are going to fix this right now. You are going to call the bank. You are going to call your lawyers, and you are going to give me exactly what I need. Because if you do not, I swear to God, the car crash is going to look like a minor inconvenience compared to what I will do to you." I whimpered again, perfectly playing the role of the broken victim. But beneath the fake tears, beneath the trembling hands, and the terrified whimpers, I felt a deep, profound sense of absolute triumph. The micro-recorder hidden beneath my collar was capturing every single violent threat, every single hateful insult, and every single desperate admission of guilt. The wolves had confidently walked right into the steel cage, and they had absolutely no idea that I was the one holding the key. Monica stepped forward, her sharp heels clicking against the ruined floorboards, breaking the physical tension Derek held over me. She placed her manicured hand on his tense arm, silently instructing him to step back. Derek released his tight grip on my shoulders, panting heavily, as he stepped away, leaving me slumped against the cheap headboard. I let out a ragged breath, wrapping my arms around my chest, as if I were trying to hold my broken ribs together. Monica did not look at me with anger. Her expression was completely devoid of any human emotion. It was the look of an executioner who had a job to finish. She unclasped her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a thick stack of papers. She did not hand them to me gently. She practically shoved the stiff documents right into my face, the sharp edge of the paper grazing my bruised cheek. I flinched, pulling my head back, my eyes widening in perfect manufactured terror. "Look at this, Richard," Monica commanded, her voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. "Read the top line. Read it and understand exactly what is happening right now." I squinted through my fake tears, my hands trembling violently as I reached out to hold the edges of the document. The bold black letters at the top of the page spelled out a voluntary relinquishment of assets and full power of attorney. It was a complete surrender. The document stated that I was of sound mind, fully aware of my declining physical condition, and voluntarily handing over every single penny, every piece of property, and every corporate share I owned directly to my son. It was a legal death sentence. I shook my head, letting out a pathetic sob. "I cannot sign this," I cried out, my voice breaking into a high-pitched whine. "I need my money to live, my company. I built that company with my bare hands. You cannot just take it all away from me. I will have absolutely nothing left." Monica let out a sharp, cruel laugh. It echoed off the peeling wallpaper of the dirty motel room. "You already have nothing, Richard. Your brain is turning into mush. You are wandering around the worst neighborhoods in the city, buying painkillers like a common addict. If you do not sign this paper right now, Derek and I are going straight to the probate judge tomorrow morning. We will show the judge your medical records. We will tell the court that you attacked us in a paranoid delusion. We will say you are highly violent, entirely unhinged, and a danger to yourself and the public." Derek stepped back into my line of sight, his face twisted in a mocking sneer. "And do you know what the judge will do, Dad?" he asked, his tone dripping with absolute malice. "The judge will not just grant us the conservatorship. He will have you immediately committed to a state-run psychiatric ward. We have a bed waiting for you at Shady Pines. Have you ever heard of Shady Pines, Dad? They love difficult patients there. They will strap you to a metal bed frame. They will pump your veins full of liquid sedatives until you cannot even remember your own name. You will never see the sunlight again. You will rot in a dark room, surrounded by people screaming at the walls." The threat was so vicious, so incredibly dark, that I did not even have to force the next round of tears. The absolute horror of their plan was enough to make my eyes water naturally. I looked back and forth between the two of them, panting, pretending to be utterly broken by the weight of their extortion. I let my shoulders collapse entirely. I let out a long, agonizing wail of defeat. "Okay," I sobbed, lowering my head in absolute submission. "Okay, I will sign it. Just please do not lock me away. Please let me go home." Monica smiled. It was a terrifying reptilian smile. She reached into her expensive coat pocket and produced a sleek silver pen. She uncapped it and aggressively shoved it into my trembling right hand. "Sign the bottom line, Richard," she instructed coldly, "and make it legible." I took the silver pen. My hand was shaking so badly that the tip of the pen rattled against the stiff paper. I looked down at the signature line. This was the moment. This was the trap closing perfectly around their greedy throats. 10 years ago, when I first started doing high-level commercial banking, my wealth management team advised me to set up a distress code. It is a specific, highly irregular signature designed exclusively for situations involving kidnapping, extortion, or coercion. If I ever signed a legal document or a bank transfer using that specific scribble, it instantly notified the federal banking authorities that the signature was obtained under severe duress. It completely and permanently nullified the document the second it was presented to any financial institution. I pressed the pen to the paper. I let my hand jerk erratically. Instead of my smooth, practiced signature, I scribbled a bizarre, jagged pattern of loops and sharp angles. It looked exactly like the desperate, uncoordinated handwriting of a man suffering from severe neurological damage. It was messy, chaotic, and entirely legally invalid. I let the pen slip from my fingers, allowing it to drop onto the dirty mattress. I fell back against the headboard, covering my face with my bruised hands, weeping loudly into the quiet room. The performance was complete. The bait had been swallowed whole. Monica immediately snatched the document right off my lap. She held it up to the flickering fluorescent light of the motel room, inspecting the jagged ink. She looked at the chaotic scribble and let out a satisfied sigh. "It is perfect," she said, turning to her husband. "It looks exactly like the signature of a dying man. The judge will not question this for a single second." Derek let out a massive breath of relief, running his hands through his damp hair. His posture instantly relaxed. The overwhelming fear of his massive debts was temporarily lifted from his shoulders, replaced by the intoxicating illusion of total victory. He looked down at me, huddled and crying on the cheap bed, and he did not show a single ounce of remorse. Instead, he simply laughed. It was a cold, empty sound. "You really are pathetic," he muttered, shaking his head. "You worked your entire life in the dirt just to hand it all over to me in a $40 motel room. You should have just stayed in the hospital. It would have been a lot more comfortable." Monica carefully folded the voluntary relinquishment of assets and slipped it securely back into her pristine leather handbag. She smoothed her white coat completely, dismissing my existence as if I were nothing more than a piece of broken furniture left behind in the room. "Let us go, Derek," she said crisply, turning toward the splintered doorway. "We need to get this to the lawyers right away to prepare for the court hearing tomorrow morning. We have a lot of accounts to transfer before the bank opens." Derek nodded eagerly. He followed his wife out the door, but he stopped for just a brief second at the threshold. He reached over and grabbed the exterior handle of the heavy wooden door. "Enjoy your stay, Dad," he called out over his shoulder. "I will send someone from the nursing home to come collect you tomorrow afternoon. Try not to wander off again." With one final forceful shove, he slammed the broken door shut. I heard the sharp metallic click of the exterior padlock they had brought with them sliding firmly into place. I was locked inside. I sat perfectly still on the sagging mattress, listening intently. I heard the sharp clicking of Monica's heels and the heavy thud of Derek's leather shoes fading quickly down the concrete walkway. A few moments later, the loud, aggressive roar of a car engine echoed through the empty industrial lot. I listened as the tires screeched violently against the broken asphalt, the sound growing fainter and fainter, until the heavy silence of the forgotten neighborhood rushed back in to fill the void. The second the sound of their engine completely disappeared, a miraculous transformation took place inside room number 7. The violent tremors in my hands stopped instantly. The pathetic, gasping sobs caught in my throat and vanished without a trace. I wiped the fake tears from my bruised cheeks with the back of my hand. I placed my feet firmly on the stained carpet and stood straight up. My posture was no longer slumped or defeated. I stood tall, my shoulders squared, the absolute authority of a self-made titan returning to my bones. The pain in my fractured ribs was still there, a dull and constant throb, but it was completely overshadowed by the massive surge of adrenaline and profound satisfaction pumping through my veins. The performance was over. The hunt was transitioning into the final phase. I reached up to the collar of my blood-stained flannel shirt. My steady fingers found the edge of the double-sided adhesive tape. With a quick, sharp tug, I pulled the military-grade micro-recorder free from the fabric. I held the tiny black device in the palm of my hand, staring at it under the harsh fluorescent light. It was smaller than a quarter, but right now, it was the most powerful weapon on the face of the earth. It held the undeniable high-definition proof of massive federal crimes: conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, coercion, and brutal extortion. I walked over to the small, wobbly wooden desk tucked into the corner of the room. I reached into the hidden compartment of the dark blue duffel bag Harrison had placed in the trunk of the getaway car earlier that day. I pulled out a sleek, lightweight laptop and a specialized decryption cable. I booted up the computer, the bright screen casting a cool glow across the peeling wallpaper. I plugged the micro-recorder into the port and entered the complex 16-digit security passcode to unlock the encrypted drive. The audio file popped up on the screen immediately. I clicked play, adjusting the volume. The tiny speakers of the laptop filled the quiet motel room with the crystal-clear, undeniable sound of my son's enraged voice. "You are going to fix this right now," the recording played, picking up every single nuance of his violent threat. "You are going to give me exactly what I need. Because if you do not, I swear to God, the car crash is going to look like a minor inconvenience compared to what I will do to you." I smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that did not reach my eyes. The audio was absolutely pristine. The jury would not just hear the words, they would hear the malice, the greed, and the terrifying sociopathy in their voices. I closed the audio player and opened my secure email client. I did not type out a long emotional message. I did not need to. I simply entered the direct encrypted email address of a very old friend. We used to drink cheap beer at a dive bar downtown 30 years ago before he climbed the ranks to become a senior special agent for the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He despised bullies, and he absolutely loathed white-collar criminals who preyed on the vulnerable. I attached the audio file to the email. I attached the high-resolution photograph of Derek, handing the massive cash bribe to my mechanic. Finally, I attached the detailed forensic accounting ledgers proving Derek's $3 million debt to the criminal underworld and his attempt to illegally liquidate my assets. In the subject line, I typed two simple words: "Happy hunting." I moved the cursor over the send button and clicked the mouse. A small notification popped up on the screen confirming the massive file had been successfully delivered to the federal servers. The trap was no longer just a family dispute. It was now a federal investigation. I shut the laptop down and packed it neatly back into the duffel bag. I walked over to the barricaded door and easily kicked the splintered wood near the rusted hinges, breaking the cheap padlock from the inside with a single forceful blow. I stepped out into the cool Ohio evening air. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the smell of exhaust and approaching rain. My heart was perfectly calm. Derek and Monica were currently speeding back to their multi-million-dollar mansion, drinking champagne and celebrating their brilliant victory. They thought they had outsmarted a broken old man. They thought tomorrow morning would be the coronation of their new stolen empire. They had absolutely no idea that when the sun rose over the probate court, they were not walking into a coronation. They were walking straight into an absolute slaughter. The next morning, the heavy gray clouds that had been gathering over Ohio finally broke, unleashing a steady, cold rain against the tall, arched windows of the county courthouse. Inside the majestic building, the atmosphere was thick with the hushed, solemn energy of the legal system. The probate courtroom was a cavernous space lined with dark, polished mahogany, high-vaulted ceilings and rows of heavy wooden benches meant for the public gallery. I was not sitting in those benches. I was standing perfectly still in the private antechamber, just outside the main double doors, surrounded by my carefully assembled team. Harrison Barnes had secured a live audio feed of the proceedings, playing through a small earpiece tucked discreetly into my right ear. I stood with my hands resting easily in the pockets of my trousers, listening to the absolute theater unfolding just a few feet away from me. My son and my daughter-in-law had arrived early, dressing themselves in the perfect costumes for their roles as the grieving, overwhelmed family members. Through the earpiece, I could hear the sharp rustle of papers as the court clerk called my case to the docket. The presiding judge was a man named Reynolds, a veteran of the probate court, known for his strict adherence to the rules, but also for his deep compassion for families dealing with genuine medical tragedies. Derek began his testimony almost immediately, and I had to physically restrain a bitter laugh at the sheer audacity of his performance. His voice echoed through the microphone, perfectly calibrated to sound shaky, exhausted, and completely heartbroken. "Your Honor," Derek began, his tone thick with manufactured sorrow. "I stand before you today, not just as a son, but as a man who is watching his personal hero slowly fade away into nothingness. My father was a brilliant, hardworking man. He built a massive company from the dirt up. But the car crash last week did something terrible to his mind. The physical injuries are healing, but the severe traumatic brain injury has fundamentally altered his reality. He is no longer the man who raised me." I listened as the judge gently asked Derek to elaborate on the specific incidents that led to this emergency petition. Derek did not hesitate. He spun a web of lies so intricate and devastating that anyone who did not know the truth would have wept for him. He told the judge that I had been suffering from mild dementia for over a year, but the recent trauma had accelerated the decline into severe, irreversible paranoia. He claimed that I had vanished from the hospital against medical advice because I was terrified of the doctors completely unaware of my own severe injuries. He painted a picture of a lost, confused old man wandering the most dangerous industrial neighborhoods of the city, buying heavy narcotic painkillers from shady pharmacies because I did not understand how to properly manage my own prescriptions. He spoke with such genuine-sounding conviction that I could almost picture the fake tears welling up in his eyes as he looked up at the judge's bench. Then came Monica's turn. She stepped up to the microphone, her voice incredibly soft and delicate. She told the court how she had spent hours searching the city for me, terrified that I would freeze to death or be robbed. "We finally found him huddled in a terrifying, filthy motel room, Your Honor," she whispered, letting a slight sob escape her lips. He was terrified. He was crying. But when he saw us, he had a brief, fleeting moment of absolute clarity. He realized that his mind was failing him. He realized he could no longer manage his massive estate or his complex company. In that brief window of sanity, he begged us to take over. He begged us to protect his legacy from his own deteriorating mind. That is when he voluntarily signed the relinquishment of assets. We did not want to burden the court with this, but the bank requires the official conservatorship decree to finalize the transfers and ensure his medical care is fully funded. The sheer staggering weight of their perjury hung in the air of the courtroom. I could hear Harrison breathing slowly beside me, his eyes locked on the heavy oak doors waiting for my signal. Inside the courtroom, Derek handed the thick leather folder to the bailiff, who carried it up to the judge's elevated desk. Within that folder was the forged medical affidavit from their corrupt paid-off physician, swearing under penalty of perjury that I was entirely incompetent. Right behind it was the piece of paper I had signed in the dirty motel room just last night. I could hear the heavy silence in the courtroom as Judge Reynolds slowly turned the pages, examining the documents. He paused, looking closely at the jagged, chaotic signature I had scribbled at the bottom of the page. I knew exactly what the judge was seeing. He was seeing the desperate, uncoordinated handwriting of a man whose brain was supposedly completely destroyed. It was the visual confirmation of every single lie Derek had just told. Based on the sworn medical testimony provided by your physician and the clear deterioration evidenced by this voluntary surrender of assets, Judge Reynolds said, his voice echoing with heavy finality. It is the opinion of this court that Richard Caldwell is no longer capable of managing his personal or financial affairs. The medical evidence is unfortunately very clear. It is always a tragedy to see a great man brought low by such an unexpected accident. The court appreciates the difficult position this family has been placed in and recognizes your willingness to step in and assume this heavy burden. Therefore, I am prepared to grant the petition for full legal conservatorship and the immediate transfer of all financial authorities to the petitioners. I reached up and pulled the small earpiece from my ear, letting it drop into my pocket. I looked at Harrison Barnes. He gave me a single firm nod. I turned my head and looked at the three other men standing with us in the shadows of the antechamber. I took a deep, steadying breath, completely shedding the persona of the broken victim. I squared my shoulders, lifting my chin, feeling the sheer terrifying power of 40 years of relentless hard work coursing through my veins. It was time. As the judge raised his heavy wooden gavel to strike the sounding block and permanently seal my fate, I reached out and pushed the massive, heavy oak doors of the courtroom. I did not push them gently. I shoved them forward with every single ounce of physical strength I possessed. The heavy brass hinges shrieked, and the massive doors slammed violently against the interior wooden walls of the courtroom with a sound like a gunshot. The deafening noise echoed like thunder through the high vaulted ceilings, instantly freezing every single person inside the room. The judge froze with his gavel suspended in midair. The court clerk gasped, dropping her pen. And Derek and Monica, who had been holding hands in a display of fake marital solidarity, physically, violently flinched. I stepped through the doorway and out of the shadows. I was not wearing a blood-stained flannel shirt or dirty work boots. I was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal gray Tom Ford suit that draped perfectly over my broad shoulders. My gray hair was neatly combed back, and while a small flesh-colored surgical strip covered the laceration on my forehead, I did not look like a victim. I looked like an absolute titan of industry. I did not limp. I did not shake. I strode straight down the center aisle of the gallery with heavy, powerful, and deliberate steps. My eyes locked directly onto my son, and they were as cold and unforgiving as solid ice. The physical reaction from Derek and Monica was something I will remember for the rest of my life. All the color instantly drained from Derek's face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw dropped open, his breath hitching in his throat, as if all the oxygen had been suddenly sucked out of the room. He took a stumbling step backward, actually bumping into the heavy wooden railing that separated the gallery from the court floor. Monica let out a sharp, genuine gasp of pure horror. Her expensive leather handbag slipped from her trembling fingers and crashed to the polished wooden floor, spilling her belongings everywhere. She stared at me as if she were looking at a ghost rising from the grave. They had left me locked in a dirty $40 a night motel room, crying and broken. The man walking toward them now was their absolute worst nightmare come to life. But the true shock was not just my sudden miraculous recovery. It was the entourage flanking me as I marched down the aisle. To my immediate right was Harrison Barnes, carrying his thick leather briefcase looking like a great white shark who had just smelled blood in the water. To my left was a man wearing a white medical coat over his suit, carrying a thick medical file. He was the chief of neurology at Ohio General Hospital, one of the most respected medical professionals in the entire state. And marching silently directly behind us, their faces completely stoic and their hands resting near their suit jackets, were two federal agents. The gold badges of the Federal Bureau of Investigation were clearly visible, clipped securely to their leather belts. Judge Reynolds lowered his gavel slowly, his eyes wide with complete confusion and rising alarm. He looked at me, then looked down at the medical affidavit sitting on his desk, claiming I was a completely incapacitated vegetable, and then looked back up at the very imposing, very angry man standing before him. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" the judge demanded, though his voice lacked its usual stern authority. "Who are you, and why are you bursting into my courtroom?" I stopped exactly 3 feet away from Derek. I did not even look at him. I kept my eyes fixed respectfully on the judge's bench. "I am Richard Caldwell." "Your Honor," I said. My voice was deep, resonant, and perfectly steady. It carried through the silent courtroom without the need for a microphone. "And I apologize for the dramatic entrance, but as you were just about to sign away my entire life, my fortune, and my fundamental human rights, based on a mountain of malicious perjury, I felt it was absolutely necessary to attend my own funeral." I turned my head slowly, locking my ice-cold gaze onto my son, whose entire body was now trembling violently under the crushing weight of his absolute failure. "And as you can clearly see, Your Honor, I am very much alive and my mind has never been sharper." The absolute silence that fell over the courtroom was so profound that I could clearly hear the heavy raindrops striking the high-arched windows. Judge Reynolds stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking, completely unable to reconcile the strong, sharply dressed man standing in the center aisle with the pathetic narrative he had just been fed. Derek looked as though he had been physically struck by a freight train. His mouth opened and closed in rapid succession, but no sound escaped his throat. Monica was visibly trembling, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the wooden railing so tightly that her knuckles had turned completely white. Harrison Barnes did not give them a single second to recover from the shock. He stepped smoothly past me, projecting an aura of absolute legal authority, and approached the judge's elevated bench. He placed his heavy leather briefcase on the wooden table and popped the brass latches. "Your Honor," Harrison began, his voice ringing with crisp, professional indignation. "The petition before you is not a desperate plea from a loving family. It is the final step in a highly calculated, malicious, and entirely fraudulent conspiracy to steal $5 million from a completely healthy man. The petitioners have just committed blatant perjury in your courtroom. To prove this, I have brought Dr. Aris Thorne, the chief of neurology at Ohio General Hospital, who personally oversaw Mr. Caldwell's medical care following his recent traffic accident. The doctor stepped forward, opening the thick medical file he had been carrying. He did not look at Derek or Monica. He addressed the judge with the calm, clinical precision of a man who dealt entirely in facts. "Your Honor," the doctor stated clearly, "I have personally reviewed every single scan, blood panel, and neurological assessment conducted on Mr. Caldwell. Aside from some fractured ribs and a superficial laceration to his forehead, his physical health is excellent. More importantly, his brain function is absolutely flawless. He shows zero signs of dementia, zero signs of cognitive decline, and zero signs of paranoia." The medical affidavit submitted by the petitioners was signed by a physician whose medical license is currently under review for accepting financial kickbacks. The document they handed you today is a crude fabricated forgery designed to deceive this court. Judge Reynolds looked down at the forged medical papers sitting on his desk, his face slowly turning a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. He looked up at Derek, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. "Is this true?" the judge demanded, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. "Did you submit a fraudulent medical evaluation to this court?" Derek was sweating profusely now. A large bead of sweat rolled down his pale forehead and dripped onto his expensive silk tie. He raised his hands defensively, his voice cracking as he desperately tried to backtrack. "Your Honor, I was just relying on the second opinion. We were worried. He was acting erratically. I only wanted to protect him." Harrison did not let the lie stand for even a fraction of a second. "He was acting erratically because he was fleeing for his life," Harrison countered loudly, his voice echoing through the massive room. "He was hiding from the very people standing before you. And as for their claim that Mr. Caldwell experienced a moment of clarity and voluntarily signed his entire estate away out of the goodness of his heart, I would like the court to hear exactly how that signature was obtained." Harrison reached into his briefcase and produced a small digital audio player. He walked over to the court clerk's desk and plugged a simple auxiliary cable into the courtroom's main speaker system. He pressed a single button. The pristine high-definition audio recorded just last night in that filthy $40 motel room filled the cavernous courtroom. Monica's cruel, venomous voice blasted through the speakers, completely shattering her carefully crafted illusion of the sweet, weeping daughter-in-law. "Look at this disgusting place," the recording echoed. "You are just a pathetic, stubborn old fool who is ruining everything." Then came the violent sound of a physical struggle followed by Derek's enraged, terrifying threats. "You are going to fix this right now. You are going to give me exactly what I need. Because if you do not, I swear to God, the car crash is going to look like a minor inconvenience compared to what I will do to you." Finally, the audio played Monica's chilling ultimatum about locking me away in the Shady Pines psychiatric ward to rot in a dark room. The entire courtroom listened in absolute horrified silence. The court clerk covered her mouth with her hand. Judge Reynolds sat perfectly rigid, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated outrage. He had dedicated his life to protecting the vulnerable, and he had just heard a son violently threatening to institutionalize his own father for financial gain. Monica closed her eyes, her face completely pale, knowing that her own voice had just sealed her fate. Derek looked like a man standing on a trapdoor with the rope already tied tightly around his neck. But Harrison was still not finished. He delivered the final crushing blow with surgical precision. He pointed to the voluntary relinquishment of assets sitting on the judge's desk. The petitioners believed that because they terrified my client, the signature on that document gave them the keys to his empire. Harrison explained, his voice thick with triumphant satisfaction. But my client is a man who prepares for every possible contingency. The chaotic scribbled signature at the bottom of that page is not the mark of a dying brain. It is a registered, highly classified banking distress code that Mr. Caldwell established with his financial institutions 10 years ago. The moment that specific signature touches a piece of paper, It legally signals that the signer is under severe duress, physical threat, or extortion. That document is not just completely null and void, Your Honor. It is physical, documented proof of a violent crime. Judge Reynolds did not hesitate for another second. He picked up his heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down onto the sounding block with such tremendous force that the loud crack echoed like a gunshot. The petition for conservatorship is immediately and permanently denied. The judge roared, his voice shaking with absolute fury. I have sat on this bench for 20 years, and I have never witnessed such a disgusting, depraved abuse of the legal system. Derek and Monica Caldwell, I am holding you both in extreme contempt of court. You will not leave this building. You are entirely a disgrace to the very concept of family. Derek frantically gripped the wooden railing, his legs giving out completely as he fell to his knees on the polished floor. No, please, Your Honor. You have to listen to me, he begged, tears of genuine panic streaming down his face. I am in terrible debt. I owe terrible people millions of dollars. They are going to kill me if I do not pay them. I only did this because I was desperate. I am a victim here. You are not a victim, a deep, authoritative voice interrupted from the back of the room. The two federal agents who had been standing like silent statues in the shadows finally stepped forward into the light. They walked purposefully down the center aisle, their leather shoes making heavy, deliberate thuds against the floorboards. The lead agent pulled his gold shield from his belt and held it up for the judge to see. We are with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division, the agent announced clearly. And you are right about one thing, Derek. You do owe a lot of money, but your private creditors are the least of your problems right now. The agent stopped right behind Derek and Monica. Derek Caldwell. The agent continued, his voice entirely devoid of sympathy. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated extortion, and conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm in relation to the intentional sabotage of a motor vehicle. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start using it immediately. The reality of federal prison finally broke whatever fragile sanity Monica had left. She realized the ship was rapidly sinking into the abyss, and she was entirely willing to use her husband as a flotation device. She let out a piercing, hysterical shriek, violently twisting her body away from Derek. She grabbed her left hand and aggressively yanked her massive custom-designed diamond wedding ring right off her finger. She threw the heavy ring directly at Derek's face. It bounced off his cheek and rolled across the courtroom floor. I had nothing to do with this, Monica screamed, her voice cracking with wild desperation. He manipulated me. He forced me to go along with it. He is a monster. He cut the brakes himself. I am entirely innocent. I never touched a single dime of the money. Harrison Barnes let out a dark, amused chuckle. He reached into his briefcase one final time and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He smoothly handed the document directly to the federal agent. It was the bank statement we had uncovered during the forensic audit. Actually, Monica Harrison said smoothly, his eyes flashing with victory. You touched exactly $10,000 of it. That is a certified wire transfer receipt, showing you personally moved the funds from your private account to pay the bribe to the auto mechanic who cut the brake lines. You also paid the non-refundable deposit to the abusive nursing home where you planned to lock my client away. You are not a victim, Monica. You are the architect. Monica stared at the bank receipt in the agent's hand, her mouth hanging open in silent, absolute horror. The agent did not waste another word. He reached to his tactical belt and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The sound of the ratcheting metal teeth clicking securely around Monica's wrists was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. She collapsed into tears, completely defeated, her designer white coat crumpling as the agent roughly pulled her arms behind her back. The second agent hauled Derek up from the floor by his expensive lapels. Derek did not fight back. He was completely limp, staring blankly at the polished wooden floor, utterly broken by the absolute destruction of his fake empire. The heavy handcuffs clicked around his wrists as well, sealing his fate. The agents turned them around and began to march them down the long center aisle toward the heavy oak doors. As they walked past me, Derek slowly lifted his head. Our eyes met for one final time. He looked exactly like the terrified little boy he used to be when he broke a window and knew he was in trouble. He opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to beg for his father to save him one last time. But I simply turned my back to him and looked out the high-arched windows at the falling rain. I had spent 40 years building a life for a son who never truly existed. Today I had finally torn down that illusion. The threat was completely neutralized. The poison was drawn from my life, and as the courtroom doors slammed shut behind them, I knew with absolute certainty that I was finally free. 6 months passed slowly since that rainy morning in the county probate courtroom, but the heavy wheels of federal justice grind exceedingly fine. Once the Federal Bureau of Investigation had their hands on the pristine audio recording from the dirty motel room, and the heavily documented financial ledgers Harrison Barnes provided, the criminal case against my son and daughter-in-law became an absolutely unstoppable avalanche. Derek initially tried to fight it. He hired a sleazy, high-priced defense attorney using the absolute last of his severely maxed-out credit cards, desperately hoping to find some kind of obscure lag lutsupamu. But there are no legal loopholes when the federal government possesses a crystal-clear high-definition recording of you violently threatening to institutionalize your own father for personal financial gain. When the federal prosecutors laid out the sheer volume of gathered evidence, including the irrefutable proof of the massive wire fraud and the terrifying conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm with the severed brake lines, Derek's aggressive defense completely collapsed. Facing the terrifying prospect of a 20-year maximum sentence, if he foolishly took the case to a jury trial, he finally broke down. He accepted a comprehensive plea deal. I sat quietly in the back row of the federal courthouse and watched my son stand before a federal judge wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit instead of his expensive custom Italian suits, and quietly plead guilty to every single criminal charge. He was sentenced to 8 hard years in a federal penitentiary. Monica did not fare much better. Despite her hysterical attempts to throw her husband completely under the bus and paint herself as a terrified, manipulated victim, the paper trail she foolishly left behind was entirely undeniable. The federal agents easily tracked the $10,000 wire transfer she sent from her personal account to the corrupt auto mechanic, completely shattering her fake defense. She was formally charged with felony conspiracy and sentenced to 3-year course in a minimum security federal prison camp. While they were locked away awaiting their respective prison transfers, their beautiful fake world on the outside was systematically and ruthlessly dismantled. The banking institution officially foreclosed on their multi-million-dollar mansion. I drove past the luxurious property once just to see it with my own eyes. The massive wrought iron gates were padlocked shut, and a large, cheap wooden auction sign was hammered unceremoniously into the perfectly manicured front lawn. The luxury vehicles were swiftly repossessed by the leasing companies. The designer clothes, the expensive jewelry, and the antique furniture were all rapidly liquidated to pay off the massive mountain of debt they had accumulated. They lost absolutely everything. Furthermore, the detailed information Harrison uncovered regarding the dangerous private lenders led to a massive federal sweep, resulting in the swift arrest of the violent loan sharks who had been threatening Derek, cleanly tying up that dangerous loose end forever. A few weeks after the official sentencing, I made a personal decision that Harrison advised strongly against. I requested a visitor pass to the Federal Correctional Institution where Derek had been permanently placed. I did not go there to gloat over his misery. I did not go there to yell at him or demand useless apologies. I went there to completely sever the final emotional tether that bound me to the painful past. The prison was a bleak concrete fortress surrounded by thick layers of razor wire and heavily armed security guards. I sat in a sterile, brightly lit visitation room, separated from the inmate side by a thick, impenetrable pane of bulletproof glass. When the heavy steel door opened on the other side, Derek walked into the room. He looked absolutely terrible. He had lost a significant amount of weight, his skin was pale and unhealthy, and the arrogant, entitled spark that used to define his entire personality was completely extinguished. He sat down heavily in the cold metal chair and slowly picked up the black plastic telephone receiver. I calmly picked up mine. We stared at each other through the thick glass for a very long time. He kept his eyes cast downward, entirely unable to meet my steady gaze. I thought about the innocent little boy I used to carry on my broad shoulders, the boy I had worked so incredibly hard in the deep trenches to provide for. I realized in that quiet moment that the boy was truly gone, completely replaced by the broken, cowardly stranger sitting across from me. "I forgive you, Derek," I said quietly into the receiver. His head snapped up quickly, his hollow eyes widening in pure, unadulterated shock. He opened his dry mouth, perhaps to speak, but I held up my scarred hand to stop him. "I am not forgiving you because you deserve it," I continued, my voice perfectly steady and completely calm. "You committed an absolutely unforgivable betrayal against your own blood. I am forgiving you entirely for my own sake. I absolutely refuse to spend the rest of my life carrying around a heavy, toxic burden of hatred and bitter resentment in my heart. The anger would only poison whatever beautiful time I have left on this earth. So I am letting it all go. I forgive you for what you maliciously tried to do to me. But you need to understand something right now with absolute crystal clarity. You are no longer my son. When you finally walk out of these prison doors in 8 long years, do not come looking for me. Do not write me pathetic letters. Do not attempt to call my phone. This is the very last time you will ever see my face or hear my voice in your entire life." I placed the black plastic receiver gently back onto the metal cradle. I stood up, turned my back on the thick glass, and walked out of the sterile visitation room without looking back a single time. I walked across the gray asphalt parking lot, toward my truck, breathing in the fresh air, like a drowning man who had just broken the surface of the water. The sky above me was a brilliant, cloudless blue, completely contrasting the dark, oppressive atmosphere of the federal penitentiary I had just left behind. For the first time in decades, I did not have a single worry about paying someone else's debts or funding a fake lifestyle that was completely built on lies and manipulation. The relentless, exhausting cycle of enabling terrible behavior was officially over. I turned the key in the ignition, listening to the powerful engine roar to life, and drove away from the facility. I watched the tall, imposing guard towers shrink in my rearview mirror until they disappeared entirely behind the distant tree line. The dark chapter of my life involving Derek Caldwell was officially closed, sealed permanently behind heavily fortified walls. Returning to my massive empty house in the wealthy suburbs after the trial was a profoundly hollow experience. The sprawling property with its pristine hardwood floors, high vaulted ceilings, and expansive rooms felt incredibly cold and completely devoid of any real joy. It was no longer a warm sanctuary. It was a giant, echoing mausoleum filled entirely with the sad ghosts of a family that had fundamentally failed. Every single corner of that massive house reminded me of the relentless pressure to maintain a wealthy facade, the endless arguments over money, and the suffocating expectations that had ultimately driven my own son to attempt a brutal murder. I realized very quickly that I could not stay there for another minute. I contacted a highly reputable real estate agent the very next morning and listed the sprawling property for immediate sale. Because of its prime location and immaculate condition, it sold in less than 2 weeks for a very substantial cash offer. I packed up only the bare essentials, the simple things that held true sentimental value, and completely walked away from the extravagant lifestyle I had spent 40 years breaking my back to build. I desperately wanted peace. I craved the quiet simplicity of nature, far removed from the cutthroat corporate world, and the shallow, social circles my son had so desperately worshipped. I spent a few weeks driving across the beautiful rolling countryside of rural Ohio until I finally found exactly what my soul was looking for. It was a beautiful, secluded 50-acre farm nestled quietly at the absolute end of a long, unpaved gravel road. The property featured a modest, sturdy farmhouse with a wraparound wooden porch, a massive vintage barn that needed some serious structural repair, and acres of wide, open green pastures bordered by dense, ancient forests. I bought the entire property outright, paying in full with a cashier check. For the first time in my entire adult life, I woke up to the gentle sound of birds singing instead of the harsh blare of city traffic or the relentless ringing of a corporate cell phone. I spent my early mornings drinking black coffee on the wooden porch, watching the bright sun rise slowly over the misty green fields, feeling a deep, profound sense of absolute serenity wash over my bruised soul. But a man who has spent 4 decades actively working with his hands cannot simply sit in a rocking chair and do absolutely nothing. I still had an incredible amount of physical energy, a vast wealth of practical knowledge, and a $5 million estate that was no longer burdened by the greedy expectations of a toxic son. I sat down with Harrison Barnes one sunny afternoon on the farmhouse porch, and we drafted a new, ironclad legal trust. With the vast majority of my $5 million fortune, I officially established the Caldwell Foundation for the trades. I completely renovated the massive wooden barn on my property, converting it into a state-of-the-art, fully equipped workshop. I bought heavy-duty lathes, precision milling machines, arc welders, pneumatic automotive lifts, and massive stacks of premium oak and cedar lumber. I wanted these teenagers to have access to the absolute best equipment available on the market. I wanted them to know that someone actually believed in their potential, enough to invest serious capital into their education. Then I reached out to several state-run orphanages and foster care programs operating throughout the state of Ohio. I offered fully funded apprenticeships to teenagers who were rapidly aging out of the system, kids who had absolutely nothing and no one in the world to rely on. The trade program was a massive success. Soon my quiet rural farm was filled with the loud sounds of power tools, heavy hammering, and the lively, hopeful chatter of young men and women learning how to build a real life from the dirt up. Some of them arrived with rough attitudes, thick emotional armor, and a deep distrust of authority. But when you put a heavy steel hammer in a young man's hand and teach him how to frame a solid wooden wall, you watch that defensive anger slowly channel into pure constructive focus. I taught them the intricate details of underground construction, the precise measurements of fine carpentry, and the complex mechanics of automotive repair. But more importantly, I taught them the fundamental values of hard work, personal integrity, and unwavering respect. I watched these incredible kids who had been completely abandoned by their own biological families transform into confident, highly skilled professionals who took genuine pride in the rough calluses on their hands and the honest sweat on their brows. They did not expect anything to be handed to them for free. They earned every single achievement through absolute dedication and true grit. They slowly became the real family I had always truly wanted. We ate dinner together every night at a massive wooden table we built ourselves, sharing stories, laughing loudly, and supporting each other through the difficult days. The profound lesson I learned from this entire horrific ordeal is that blood is ultimately just biology. Simply sharing the exact same genetic code does not guarantee love, and it certainly does not guarantee loyalty. True loyalty and profound mutual respect are the absolute only things that genuinely make a family. I would rather leave my entire legacy, my wealth, and my hard-earned knowledge to a group of complete strangers who truly appreciate the value of an honest day of work than hand it over to a group of entitled leeches who simply happen to share my last name. The hardworking kids in my program look at me with genuine admiration, not because of the money sitting in my bank account, but because of the time and the care I invest directly into their futures. They saved my life just as much as I saved theirs. I survived the absolute darkest betrayal a loving father can ever experience, and I used that terrible darkness to build a permanent beacon of absolute hope. Thank you for listening to Rick's story. Do you think 8 years was enough for what Derek tried to do? Let me know in the comments, and tell me what city you are watching from today. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to support fathers who fight back. See you in the next story.